I never thought I would lose Richard. Not like this. Not so suddenly. For 45 years, I had been his wife. His partner. The woman who cooked his meals, washed his clothes, and slept beside him through every season of our long life together. I thought I knew him inside and out. I thought I could predict his every move. I thought wrong. It happened on a Tuesday. A forgettable day. Ordinary in every way, until it wasn't. Richard was supposed to be at the doctor's office. A routine checkup, the kind that had become all too frequent now that age had settled into his bones. He never rushed these things. He liked to chat with the nurses, take his time reading the medical pamphlets in the waiting room. That's why I wasn't worried when I let him into our home. Thomas. He was a mistake. A passing indulgence. A brief flicker of passion in a life that had long since settled into predictable monotony. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. He made me feel young. I told myself it was nothing serious. Just a harmless, foolish distraction. But I knew, deep down, that it was wrong. And then, the front door creaked open. I didn't hear Richard's footsteps at first. I was too caught up in the moment, too wrapped in the heat of Thomas's embrace to sense the storm gathering behind me. But I felt it, the shift in the air, the sudden, chilling stillness. And when I turned, I saw him. Richard stood in the doorway, his frail frame stiff as a board, his blue eyes dark with something I couldn't name. He didn't say a word. Not a single syllable. He just stared. The room shrank around me. My stomach twisted violently, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Thomas, the fool, stepped away, mumbling something incoherent, as if there was anything that could possibly excuse what Richard had just witnessed. "Richard," I whispered, reaching for him. He flinched. Actually flinched away from my touch. That was the moment I knew. I had broken something in him. Something that could never be put back together. Still, I tried. "Please, listen to me," but he turned, walked out the door, and left without a word. At first, I was relieved. Relieved that he hadn't yelled, hadn't made a scene. Richard had always been a quiet man, a thinker rather than a talker. I convinced myself that once the initial shock faded, he would come back. He would listen. He would forgive. He had to. That night, I waited. Hours passed, and he didn't return. I called his phone, no answer. I left messages, pleading, explaining, promising it had been a mistake, a one-time mistake. No response. By the time the grandfather clock in our living room chimed midnight, an eerie unease settled over me. Richard wasn't the kind of man who disappeared without saying where he was going. Something was different this time. The next morning, I got my answer. A knock at the door. A man in a suit. A folder of legal documents in his hands. "Mrs. Lawson?" My throat tightened. "Yes?" "My name is Mr. Calloway. I represent your husband, Richard Lawson." The words were like a slap. "What?" He handed me the papers. "Mr. Lawson has filed for divorce. Effective immediately." I felt the blood drain from my face. Divorce? No. That wasn't possible. Not Richard. He wasn't strong enough to leave me. He needed me. He always had. "This has to be a mistake," I said, my voice shaking. He wouldn't, but he had. The papers were real. The signature at the bottom of the last page? That was real too. Richard was done. A cold, sinking dread settled in my gut as I stood there, gripping the papers in trembling hands. I had taken him for granted, assumed his love was something permanent, something unconditional. I had believed, foolishly, that he would never walk away. But I had underestimated him. And now, I was about to lose everything. I clung to denial the way a drowning person clings to a piece of driftwood. Richard had been furious, but surely, he wouldn't go through with the divorce. Not after everything we had been through. 45 years of marriage couldn't just disappear overnight. I had made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake, but didn't I deserve a second chance? He just needed time. That's what I told myself. But as the days passed, reality settled in like a thick, suffocating fog. Richard was not the man I thought he was, not anymore. He was cold. Unforgiving. Determined. I tried calling. He never answered. I wrote him letters, spilling my heart onto the page, but they were all returned unopened. I even tried to visit him at his lawyer's office, hoping for just a moment to explain, but he refused to see me. The man I had known for nearly half a century was gone. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the real nightmare began. It started with a conversation I wasn't meant to overhear. Daniel had invited me over for dinner, mostly out of obligation. My son had been distant since Richard left, and I could sense his resentment simmering beneath the surface. He was hurt that his father had walked away from our family, hurt that I had been the one to drive him away. He barely spoke as we ate, pushing food around his plate, his jaw tight. I tried to fill the silence, reminiscing about the past, about when things were simpler. But Daniel remained cold, distant. And then, his wife, Helen, made an offhand comment. "It's crazy, isn't it?" she said, reaching for the wine. After all these years, for Richard to suddenly wonder, Daniel shot her a look so sharp that she immediately fell silent. I set down my fork. "Wonder what?" Helen hesitated. "It's nothing." But I knew better. "Daniel?" My voice was tight. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Dad wanted a DNA test." The words barely made sense. "A what?" He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. "A paternity test. He took one last week." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Why would he? And then it hit me. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands trembled as I reached for my glass of water, my pulse roaring in my ears. Richard knew. Somehow, after all these years, he had figured it out. I forced out a nervous laugh, but it sounded hollow even to me. "That's ridiculous." "Of course, you're his son." Daniel didn't respond. Panic clawed its way up my throat. "Daniel." My voice cracked. "Tell me you didn't take the test." Silence. And then, finally, the results came in today. My stomach twisted so violently that I thought I might be sick. Daniel stood, pushing his chair back. "Harold is my father." I had spent decades convincing myself that the past no longer mattered. That Richard and I had built a life strong enough to bury old secrets. But here it was. Unearthed. Exposed. Destroying everything. I shook my head, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "Daniel, please, how long?" His voice was low, dangerous. "How long have you known?" I swallowed hard. "Daniel, let me explain. How long, Mom?" he snapped. I couldn't lie to him. Not anymore. "Since the beginning," I whispered. His face twisted in something between anger and heartbreak. "So, my whole life, you let me believe a lie?" Tears blurred my vision. "I did it to protect you." He laughed bitterly. "No. You did it to protect yourself." I reached for him, desperate, but he stepped back. "Does Dad know?" I nodded. "He just found out." Daniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "No wonder he's leaving." The call came later that night. I had barely made it through the door when the phone rang. My heart lurched. I had been waiting for Richard to reach out, hoping this would be the moment he let me explain. But the voice on the other end wasn't his. "This is Dr. Reynolds from St. Luke's Hospital." "Are you Margaret Lawson?" "A hospital." Oh God. I gripped the counter, my legs weak. "Yes. Your husband collapsed earlier this evening. He's stable now, but you should come as soon as possible." I barely remember driving. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I prayed, begged, promised anything just to have another chance. When I arrived, Richard was in a hospital bed, pale, his breathing shallow. But his eyes were open. He saw me the moment I entered, and the expression on his face nearly broke me in half. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was grief. I rushed to his side. "Richard," his hand went up, stopping me cold. "No," his voice was hoarse. "You don't get to talk." Tears filled my eyes. "Please, did you ever love me?" The question was so quiet I almost missed it. I gasped. "Of course, I did." He studied me for a long moment, and then he nodded, as if he had finally reached a conclusion. "I'm leaving," he said. I blinked. "Richard, you don't have to, I do." His voice was steel. "You've taken everything from me. My wife. My best friend. My son." His throat worked as he swallowed. "I won't let you take what's left of me." Panic surged through me. "Richard, please, we can fix this. We can talk to Daniel." "No," he turned his head away. "I don't want to fix anything." His words cut deeper than a knife. The next morning, Richard was discharged. He left the hospital, left the city, left everything. No goodbyes. No explanations. Just gone. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to truly be alone. I had given my whole life to a lie. 45 years of love, of sacrifice, of devotion, wasted. Margaret had been my world. The woman I cherished, the mother of the son I thought was mine. But now, standing in the empty house we once shared, all I could feel was rage. Not the kind that burned bright and faded. No, this was something colder, something deeper. A rage that settled into my bones. I was done. Done being a fool. Done being the man who gave and gave while others took from me. I picked up the pen and signed my name one last time, finalizing the transfer of assets. The house, my investments, everything we built together, I left none of it to Margaret. She didn't deserve a single cent. But Daniel, despite everything, was innocent. He may not have been my flesh and blood, but I had raised him. I had held him as a baby, taught him how to ride a bike, sat in the front row at his college graduation, and watched him become a man. That love, the real kind, didn't disappear overnight. Even if I couldn't bear to look at him anymore. I signed over certain assets in his name, giving him enough to live comfortably, to support his family. It was duty. Nothing more. As for me, I was leaving. Not just the house, not just the city. I was erasing myself from the life I had once known. No forwarding address. No way back. The travel agent gave me a strange look when I bought the ticket. "Just one way?" she asked, typing on her computer. I nodded. "One way." She smiled politely, not knowing I was buying my freedom. The destination was one Margaret and I had talked about for years, a quiet coastal town, a place where the ocean stretched endlessly, where the air smelled of salt and freedom. We had always dreamed of retiring there, of watching the sunset from the porch, of growing old together. But those were her dreams. Our dreams. And she had burned them to the ground. Now, it would be my refuge. My place to start over. I took one last look at the city skyline through the taxi window. Then, without a single word to the life I was leaving behind, I turned away. Daniel had barely slept. He sat in his darkened living room, whiskey untouched in his glass, staring at the DNA test results. 74.8% probability. Harold Jensen, biological father. The numbers blurred in his vision. His whole life had been a lie. He had Richard's mannerisms, his values, his work ethic, but none of his blood. The man who had raised him, the man who had loved him, was not his father. Instead, it was Harold. His godfather. His father's best friend. Daniel felt sick. All those years. All those years. And nobody told him. Not his mother. Not Harold. Not even Richard, until now. The betrayal cut deeper than he could express. And there was only one thing left to do. He arrived at his mother's house without calling first. The door swung open, and there she was, Margaret, still wearing the robe she had probably been crying in all night. Her eyes widened when she saw him, hope flashing across her face for a split second. Daniel, thank God, he shoved the DNA test results into her hands. How long? Margaret paled. His voice was steel. How long have you known? She swallowed hard, looking anywhere but at him. Daniel, how long, Mom? Her hands trembled. Since the beginning. Daniel let out a sharp breath, the final confirmation slamming into his chest like a hammer. You let me believe a lie, he whispered. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I was young, Daniel. I was scared. I never meant for it to happen, but it did happen, he snapped. And you let Richard raise me, love me, give me everything, while Harold sat back and said nothing. Margaret reached for him. I did it to protect you. No. He stepped back. You did it to protect yourself. Tears spilled down her face. Daniel, please, where's Harold? His voice was ice. Margaret hesitated. Daniel, just listen, where is he? Silence. Then, he's at home, she admitted. Daniel clenched his jaw. Then that's where I'm going. He turned, heading for the door. Margaret called after him. Daniel, please, just let this go. But he didn't stop. There was no letting this go. Not anymore. Harold's house was just as Daniel remembered it. A modest, well-kept place where he had spent countless holidays, listening to Harold tell stories, laughing at his jokes, never once suspecting the truth. Daniel pounded on the door. A few moments later, Harold answered, his expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. Daniel. Daniel shoved the DNA results into his chest. Explain this. Harold's face drained of color. Explain it. Daniel's voice cracked, fury barely restrained. Harold let out a slow breath, glancing at the paper as if it were an old ghost come to haunt him. I always wanted to tell you. Daniel laughed bitterly. But you didn't. You let another man raise your son. You let me believe a lie. Harold swallowed hard. It wasn't my decision to make, Daniel. Daniel took a step forward. You had 44 years to tell me the truth. His voice was raw. And now, because of this, because of all of this, Richard is gone. Harold stiffened. Gone? He left. Daniel's throat tightened. He sold the house. He took his money. He disappeared. Harold looked genuinely shaken, guilt flashing across his face. I never wanted this. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Then you should have told the truth. Silence. And then, I'm sorry, Daniel. Harold's voice was barely above a whisper. But it was too late for apologies. The damage was already done. And somewhere, far from the life he had once built, Richard was erasing himself from their world. Forever. The silence in the house was suffocating. For over 4 decades, this home had been filled with life, love, arguments, and laughter. Now, it was empty. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where Richard used to sit every morning, sipping his coffee, reading the newspaper, making some dry comment about the state of the world. That chair would never be occupied by him again. Richard was gone. Not just angry. Not just giving me the cold shoulder. Gone. He had vanished, leaving nothing behind but signed papers, empty drawers, and the cold realization that I had underestimated him. I thought I knew my husband. I thought he would yell, curse, maybe even break something. I thought he would give me the silent treatment, punish me with his distance, but eventually come back. But this? Selling the house? Disappearing without a trace? I had pushed him too far. And I had lost. I needed Daniel. He had always been my son, my protector, my confidant. Even as a child, he had been closer to me than to Richard. Richard had been the provider, the guiding hand, but I had been the one Daniel turned to when he needed comfort, advice, reassurance. But when I showed up at his door, he didn't even invite me inside. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face hard, eyes filled with betrayal. "Mom," he said, his voice exhausted. "What do you want?" I blinked at him. "What do I want?" "Daniel, your father," I caught myself. "Richard is gone. He's disappeared. I need your help to find him." Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "Disappeared? Can you blame him?" "Daniel, please, you want me to help you?" His jaw clenched. "After what you did? After everything?" I stepped forward, reaching for his arm, but he pulled away. "You lied to me my entire life," he said coldly. "And now, when it all comes crashing down, you come to me like I'm supposed to pick up the pieces?" I was scared, I whispered. "I was young, and I made mistakes, but Daniel, you are my son. I love you." He stared at me, something unreadable in his expression. "You know what's funny?" His voice was quiet, controlled. "Richard still left something for me. Even after all of this. Even after knowing I wasn't his son, he still made sure I was taken care of." I swallowed hard. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "But you? You don't love anyone but yourself, Mom." His words stung like a slap. "You should go," he said finally. My chest tightened. "Daniel, please. You don't mean that." "I do." His expression didn't soften. "Go." For the first time in my life, my son, the boy I had carried, raised, loved, shut the door in my face. I had no one. Richard was gone. Daniel had shut me out. And Harold? I hated Harold. If he had never come into my life, if he had never been Richard's best friend, if he had never, but no. That was a lie. The truth was, I had made my choices. I had let Harold into my bed, into my life. I had convinced myself I could control everything, that secrets could stay buried forever. I had destroyed my own life. But I wasn't going to sit back and let Richard disappear. I still had connections. Old friends. People we had known for decades. Someone had to have seen him, had to have heard something. I picked up the phone and started making calls. "Richard? No, I haven't seen him in weeks." "What's going on?" "Disappeared?" "That doesn't sound like Richard." "You sure he's not just staying with Daniel?" One by one, the same responses. No one knew where he was. No one had seen him. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. Richard had erased himself completely. No social media, no emails, no paper trail. He had planned this. Carefully. Deliberately. And he had done it so well that even I, his wife of 45 years, had no way of finding him. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Panic. The last person I wanted to turn to was Harold. But I had no choice. I drove to his house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When he opened the door, his face fell. "Margaret," he sighed. "Don't say my name like that," I snapped. His shoulders slumped. "I know why you're here." "Then fix it." He gave me a tired look. "You think I can just snap my fingers and make Richard reappear? You're the reason this happened." My voice cracked. "You ruined everything." Something flickered in his eyes, pain. "I didn't make you cheat, Margaret." My breath caught. "You made that choice," he said quietly. "Just like I did. We both lied. We both betrayed him." He exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "But Richard was my best friend. I never wanted to hurt him." I clenched my fists. "Well, congratulations. You did. Harold swallowed hard. I know. I hated him. I hated him for being right. For being the only person left in my life. For being the only one who could possibly help me. Do you know where he went? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Harold hesitated. Harold. He sighed. I have an idea. My breath caught. Where? He met my gaze. Somewhere we used to talk about. A place by the ocean. A bitter laugh escaped me. Of course. Of course. Richard had gone to the place we had dreamed of retiring. But he had gone alone. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the remnants of my life. Pictures on the walls, memories in every piece of furniture. But the house wasn't mine anymore. Richard had sold it. Soon, would have to leave. Everything was unraveling. I had thought I could control it. I had thought I could fix it. But for the first time in decades, I realized the truth. Richard wasn't coming back. And I was truly, completely alone. Daniel sat in his car outside his childhood home, or what used to be his home. It was still hard to believe it was being sold. This was the house where he had grown up, where he had learned to ride a bike, where he had spent countless nights listening to the quiet hum of his parents' voices downstairs. He always thought it would be his one day, passed down to him, a piece of family history to preserve. But now? Richard was gone. His mother was unraveling. And he wasn't even really Richard's son. Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tightening. Who am I? For 44 years, he had believed he was Richard's son, a man who had taught him how to be strong, responsible, disciplined. And now, with a simple DNA test, all of that had changed. Harold. Harold was my real father. The thought made his stomach turn. He didn't want Harold to be his father. He didn't want to be the product of an affair. And yet, here he was, someone else's blood. A part of Daniel didn't want to face Harold. But another part of him, the angry, bitter part, needed answers. So he found himself standing outside Harold's house, fists clenched, heart pounding. He knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Harold must have been expecting this. Daniel, he said, his voice careful, almost hesitant. Daniel's stomach twisted at the sound of his name. His real father's voice. He pushed past Harold and stepped inside. How long have you known? Daniel demanded, turning to face him. Harold sighed, rubbing his hands together. Since before you were born. Daniel's breath caught. Before? Harold nodded. Your mother told me she was pregnant, but that she was staying with Richard. She told me I had to stay quiet. That it would ruin everything if the truth came out. Daniel clenched his jaw. So, what did you do? Harold swallowed hard. I let it happen. His voice was quiet. I stood by and watched another man raise my son because I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought keeping my distance was the best choice for you. Daniel felt his hands shake. The best choice for me? He let out a hollow laugh. You didn't do this for me. You did it for yourselves. Harold opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel wasn't finished. You let me go my entire life thinking Richard was my father. You let him pour his love, his time, his entire existence into raising me, while you sat back in the shadows, watching. Harold's face paled. I wanted to be in your life. I did. Daniel took a step closer, his voice trembling with rage. You may be my father, he said, his voice sharp as a knife, but you'll never be my dad. Daniel drove aimlessly after leaving Harold's house. His mind was flooded with memories that felt different now. Richard teaching him how to shave. Richard taking him fishing, even though they both hated it. Richard sitting in the stands, cheering him on at his high school games. Richard calling him son. Had it all been a lie? No. Daniel shook his head. No. Richard had loved him. And that was the most painful part of all. Richard had been more of a father than Harold ever could be. And now, Richard was gone. Daniel gritted his teeth. He had to find him. Not just for himself. For the only father he had ever known. I thought I knew my husband. For 45 years, I was certain of one thing: Richard needed me. He was steady, reliable, predictable. Even when I made mistakes, I believed, deep down, that he would always forgive me. But now? Now, I had lost him. He vanished without a word, and suddenly, I was nothing. I searched everywhere. I called his old colleagues, reached out to his friends, many of whom refused to speak to me. Even Daniel was distant, lost in his own pain. The silence was unbearable. But then, one evening, I got a call. It was from one of our old friends, a woman who hesitated before speaking. "I don't think you should go looking for him, Margaret," she warned. But I had to. "Where is he?" I pressed. A long sigh. "The coast," she finally said. "A small town by the ocean. He's not the same man anymore." I hung up and packed my bags. Richard was waiting. He just didn't know it yet. The drive to the coast felt longer than it should have. The town was quiet, the kind of place we had always dreamed of retiring to. Before I ruined everything. I spotted him before he saw me. And when I did, my breath caught in my throat. Richard was different. Stronger. Healthier. Happier. And he wasn't alone. There, beside him, walking along the shore, was a woman, Eleanor. I recognized her immediately. She was someone from Richard's past, a woman he once loved before we met. A widow now, from what I had heard. And from the way she laughed at something he said, the way he looked at her. I knew. My heart twisted in my chest. Richard had moved on. Without me. I waited until he was alone before I approached him. He was standing near a small cafe, sipping a cup of coffee, staring at the waves. He looked so at peace, it made me ache. Richard. His body stiffened. Slowly, he turned. When his eyes met mine, there was no warmth. No anger, either. Just, nothing. "I found you," I whispered. His expression didn't change. I didn't want to be found. I swallowed hard. "Please, Richard. Let's talk." He didn't move. "About what?" I took a shaky breath. "About us. About what I did. I know I hurt you, but 45 years can't just disappear. You still love me, I know you do." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he spoke. "I was a fool for 45 years, Margaret. I won't be one for a second longer." The words slashed through me. Tears burned my eyes. "Richard, please. We built a life together. We raised a son together," his jaw tightened. "A son who isn't mine." I flinched. "But you still love him." "I do," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean I have to love you." Pain like I had never known crushed me. Richard had forgiven me for so much over the years. I never thought there would come a day when he wouldn't. But that day had come. And I had no one to blame but myself. I reached for his hand. He pulled away. A lump rose in my throat. "So that's it?" Richard stared at me for a long time. Then he exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't hate you, Margaret," he said softly. "But I don't love you anymore." Tears slipped down my cheeks. And with that, he turned and walked away. Back to his new life. Back to Eleanor. And for the first time in my life, I knew what it felt like to truly lose. I had never known a pain like this. The man I built a life with, the man who had once looked at me with nothing but devotion, had turned his back on me. I wasn't ready to accept it. I couldn't. But it wasn't just Richard who had become distant. Daniel was slipping away from me too. For days, he had barely spoken to me. I saw the storm in his eyes every time we were in the same room. He was struggling, torn between the father who raised him and the truth that had shattered his world. Then one evening, he stood in front of me, his jaw clenched. "I'm going to see him," he said. My heart pounded. "Daniel, he doesn't want, I don't care," he cut me off. "I need to talk to him." I knew better than to argue. So I let him go. And I prayed. Prayed that maybe, just maybe, Richard would listen to him. Prayed that if I couldn't bring him back, our son could. Daniel returned late that night. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale. I had never seen him look so lost. I rushed to him. "Did you see him?" He's never coming back," he said, his voice hollow. I felt my stomach drop. "Daniel," he shook his head. I asked him if he ever really loved me. If I was just a reminder of everything you did. My throat tightened. "And what did he say?" Daniel swallowed hard. "He told me that love isn't about blood. That I'll always be his son." A sob slipped from my lips. But Daniel didn't cry. He just sat down, running a hand through his graying hair, looking older than I had ever seen him. "I ruined everything," I whispered. Daniel didn't respond. And that silence was its own kind of punishment. The next morning, I found an envelope by the door. My name was written on it in Richard's familiar, steady handwriting. With shaking hands, I tore it open. His words destroyed me. "Margaret, I have spent my entire life forgiving you. I forgave the little lies, the moments of selfishness, the times you took me for granted. I even forgave the years of betrayal that I didn't know about. But this, I cannot forgive. Not because I hate you, but because I have finally learned to love myself. I spent 45 years loving you, Margaret. But I have never loved myself. That changes now. Thank you for the years we had. For the son we raised, my son. But this is my goodbye. I will not look back. I will not change my mind. I am choosing myself." Richard, the paper slipped from my fingers. And for the first time, I truly understood. I had lost him. Not because he hated me. But because he was finally free. Regret is a slow, merciless thing. It doesn't strike all at once, it lingers, creeping into quiet moments, filling the empty spaces where love used to be. For weeks after receiving Richard's letter, I existed in a fog. I barely left the house. I barely ate. The world around me moved on, but I remained stuck, trapped in the ruins of my own making. I had spent years convincing myself that Richard would never leave me. That no matter what I did, he would always be there, steadfast and forgiving. But I was wrong. He was gone. And this time, he wasn't coming back. Daniel visited one afternoon. I had been expecting him, though I wasn't sure what he would say. When he stepped inside, I saw the change in him immediately. There was a tiredness in his eyes, a weight that had settled into his features. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once served him breakfast before school, where we had shared 1,000 conversations over the years. But this time, there was no warmth between us. "I've decided to cut ties with Harold," he said simply. I let out a slow breath. "I see." He looked at me carefully. "Do you?" I swallowed. "I understand that this has been hard on you, Daniel. That you feel betrayed." He shook his head. "It's more than that, Mom. It's not just the lie, it's that I don't even know who I am anymore. My entire life, I thought I was Richard's son. And in every way that matters, I was." I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. The rejection stung, but I didn't blame him. "Richard and I talked," he continued. "He told me that blood doesn't change what we had. That I will always be his son." Tears welled in my eyes. "He still loves you." Daniel nodded. "He does. But he's moved on, Mom. He's happy." The words sent a fresh wave of pain through me. "He's happy. Without me." I wanted to believe that Richard would eventually forgive me. That one day, he would come back, even if only as a friend. But as the months passed, I saw the truth. He had truly let go. The last time I heard from him was through Daniel. He had settled into his new life. With her. I pictured him walking along the beach, hand in hand with Eleanor, his laughter carried by the ocean breeze. The thought made my chest ache. Eleanor had always been a shadow in our marriage, an old love that Richard had let go of in order to choose me. And in the end, I had thrown that choice away. Now, he had chosen her. And I had no one. I sat by the window that night, watching the rain fall. I thought about all the times Richard had sat across from me, telling me stories, making me laugh, forgiving me, always forgiving me. But this time, he had saved his forgiveness for himself. I had spent 45 years believing that I held all the power in our marriage. That I could take, and Richard would always be there to give. But I had been wrong. And in the end, it wasn't Richard who had lost everything. It was me. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful and emotional stories. What would you have done in Richard's place? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more, and until next time, take care. See you soon.